Kashmir Forum, an organization that strives to bring the issues of the Kashmiri Pandit diaspora to the forefront of policy and media. This event is actually an extension of our advocacy efforts, in which 3 weeks ago we were able to undertake on Capitol Hill, where we were bringing the stories of the Kashmiri Pandits to Washington D.C. and to the halls of Congress. Today we're bringing them on the sidelines of the State Department Ministerial, which seeks to advance religious freedom at the highest levels of the United States government, and extending that support to foreign leaders as well. Today we are delighted to have Mr. Raj Koul from Chicago, who is a Kashmiri Pandit who has lived this experience. And shortly after our video, he'll be joined in a fireside chat. We can imagine a proverbial fireplace here, but this fireside chat will be moderated by our very own Executive Director, Suhag Shukla. But before we begin with that, we'd like to just give some context to the Kashmiri Pandit story by sharing one of the latest publications that HAF has produced, our video, the history of the Kashmir conflict. So thank you very much for all joining us.
One of the biggest myths about Kashmir is that it's disputed territory. It isn't. It is an integral part of India. Ancient Kashmir was home to a majority Hindu and Buddhist population for thousands of years, and a renowned center for Hindu and Buddhist learning. Islamic invaders from Central Asia took control in the 14th century. From then on, Hindus faced periods of persecution, resulting in mass migrations from the region roughly once a century until the late 1700s. In the early 1800s, Sikh rulers controlled the region, followed by a Hindu dynasty from the mid-1800s through 1947. The historic region of Kashmir is roughly 86,000 square miles and is now divided between 3 countries: India, China, and Pakistan. 1/3 is occupied by Pakistan and is known as Pakistan-occupied Kashmir and the northern areas. 1/5 is controlled by China as a result of a boundary settlement with Pakistan and occupation of land during the 1962 Indo-China War. The remaining territory forms the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir. The Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir is divided into 3 parts: the Kashmir Valley, Jammu, and Ladakh. While the total population of around 12.5 million is religiously diverse, the valley is majority Muslim, Jammu majority Hindu, and Ladakh almost half Buddhist. Overall, 67% of Jammu Kashmir's population is Muslim, 30% Hindu, and 2% Sikh. Buddhists and others comprise another 1%. 1947, Kashmir becomes part of the Republic of India. When the British divided India into 2 countries, India and Pakistan, all princely states were allowed to choose which country they wished to join. The state of Jammu and Kashmir was ruled by Maharaja Hari Singh, who struggled to decide between joining one of the 2 countries or remaining independent. Behind the scenes, the British were manipulating events to ensure that Kashmir is ceded to Pakistan to protect their own interests and influence in the region. In the meantime, Pakistan sent its armed forces and Pashtun warriors to invade Kashmir. Hari Singh asked India for help, and with the support of other Kashmiri political leaders, legally acceded the state of Jammu and Kashmir to the Republic of India in 1947. India then deployed its forces to counter the attacks by Pakistan. British military agents and officers continued to meddle, even after accession, including helping Pakistani forces occupy the strategic location of Gilgit in the northern part of the state. 1948, the plebiscite that never was. In 1947, the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir became a part of the newly formed Republic of India, shortly after Pakistani armed forces and Pashtun warriors invaded the area. The sudden invasion forced the largest Kashmiri political party to quickly approve the accession. Indian forces were deployed to counter the attacks by Pakistan. In 1948, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 47, requiring all Pakistani military personnel to be withdrawn from the region before a plebiscite could be called, a plebiscite which would have confirmed the people's wishes to join India. Instead, Pakistan increased its military presence, and no plebiscite was ever held. Under the conditions of Article 370 of India's constitution, non-Kashmiris were prevented from moving to or owning land in Kashmir. In the areas occupied by Pakistan, 41,000 Hindu families, most of whom were indigenous to the region, were forced to flee due to the violence and terror. 1989 to today, Pakistan's proxy war in Kashmir. In 1989, an insurgency sponsored by Pakistan's military and intelligence service engulfed the Kashmir Valley. Since then, nearly 15,000 civilians have been killed in militant-related violence. In combating militants, the Indian Army and state police have also committed abuses. Today, militant groups active in Kashmir, such as Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed, are designated as foreign terrorist organizations by the United States. Both have launched terror attacks not only in Kashmir, but in other parts of India. In 2001, Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed collaborated to attack the Indian Parliament in New Delhi, killing 9 people in a high-profile attack on a prominent symbol of India's democracy. Lashkar-e-Taiba was also responsible for the November 2008 Mumbai attacks, which left at least 165 people dead, including security personnel and civilians, of which over 24 were foreign nationals. Jaish-e-Mohammed was responsible for the September 18, 2016 attack on an Indian Army base and the February 14, 2019 attack on a base in Pulwama district of Jammu and Kashmir, leaving over 40 members of the Central Reserve Police Force dead and a similar number injured. 1989 to 1991, the ethnic cleansing of Kashmiri Hindu Pandits. The Pakistan-sponsored insurgency included plans to communally cleanse Kashmir of non-Muslims in order to change the state's demographics. Between 1989 and 1991, over 350,000 Kashmiri Pandits, who account for over 95% of the valley's indigenous Hindu population, were ethnically cleansed from the valley in a campaign of targeted killings, rapes, threats, and destruction of properties and religious sites. Letters were sent to the homes of Pandits stating, "We order you to leave Kashmir immediately. Otherwise, your children will be harmed. We are not scaring you, but this land is only for Muslims and is the land of Allah. Sikhs and Hindus cannot stay here. If you do not obey, we will start with your children. Kashmir Liberation, Zindabad." One elderly Kashmiri Hindu woman told the BBC, quote, "Our people were killed. I saw a girl tortured with cigarette butts. Another man had his eyes pulled out and his body hung on a tree," end quote. For the past 25 years, thousands of displaced Hindu Pandits have lived in camps in Jammu and New Delhi, while successive governments have failed to safely rehabilitate them to the valley. In our final segment of this series, we will pick up in 2001, when militant violence declines, until 2016, when it returns, after the death of a Hizbul Mujahideen commander, and we'll discuss what must be done to achieve peace and stability in the region. Stay tuned.
Thank you very much. Before we begin with our formal part of the program, we actually want to acknowledge the presence of 2 United States commissioners from the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, Anurima Bhargava and Johnny Moore. So thank you for joining us, and if either of you wish to share remarks, we would love to have you before you have to depart for your next event. Thank you.
Very quickly, unfortunately, Johnny and I both have to speak across the street in a few minutes, and I just wanted to thank you all for being here. I am the second of the Hindu commissioners on the U.S. Commission on international religious freedom. And so, I've known Suhag and Jay and many others for a very long time, and I think it's really important that we continue to talk about the ways in which the Hindu community and other communities around the world have faced religious persecution and violence, not only in Kashmir and in other parts of the South Asian region and around the world. And so I'm happy to be able to spend a little bit of time. I wish we could stay longer, and please think of me as someone you can reach out to for any of the kinds of concerns you may be having around Hindu communities around the world. So,
thank you, Commissioner Bhargava and Commissioner Moore for your, actually, if Commissioner Moore would like to share a few words with please.
हिंदी में थोड़ा right? मेरा नाम Johnny. आप कैसे हैं? I think that's all I remember. India is a country I have always loved. I've been to the country 20 times, and I have learned more than I even knew from my colleague on the commission. And when we heard you guys were meeting here and we had to be across the street there, we just wanted to take advantage of the opportunity to be here. And also, I mean, with the just watching this video, and I'd love to get the next part of it since we won't have time to watch it now. So it'd be great. Maybe somebody can get it to me. But I'm just sitting here thinking about the news from earlier today about the head of Taiba, being incarcerated in Pakistan. So and with the Pakistani Prime Minister coming this weekend, as a totally non-partisan commission. We have the wonderful opportunity working collaboratively, appointed by both parties on issues that are important to all of us. And so we don't pick sides except for the side that advances the human rights of all people, whatever their religion. And so, sorry we can't stay any longer, but we're very happy we had the opportunity to be with you for a few moments.
Thank you to both of our commissioners who actually do this job in a volunteer capacity. They take time out of their personal schedules to address the issues of religious freedom around the world. Now, without further ado, let's begin with why we're here. We're here to have a chat, and this is going to be an interactive dialogue between our two speakers and the audience as well. But first, let's get started with Raj Koul, who is an IT engineer with United Airlines. And he's here from Chicago, Illinois. He came here at the very first moment that he found out about this event, and we thank him. And our Executive Director, Suhag Shukla, who's also a co-founder of the Indo-American Foundation.
Thank you, everyone. As Jay mentioned, this is another piece of the story that we've been working on for well over 16 years in trying to bring awareness and voice to a huge community and that has suffered, and a story that's largely been ignored, whether it's mainstream media or the halls of power where policy is made. And so we're really pleased to have you with us here today, and even more so, Raj, for joining us. It was a trek, and our weather here in DC hasn't been also great. But more so, thank you for sharing your story, because we know that these are difficult memories that we're going to be asking you to conjure up. But I think that the importance of telling and sharing these stories is that if we don't know, history will repeat itself, and that's why it's important that we keep telling these stories, not only for justice, but to avoid such atrocities in the future. So with that, I'll start with, we got a good kind of geopolitical overview of what's been going on in Kashmir largely since India's independence. And so I'd like to maybe first, before we talk about your personal experiences, let's go back. We're talking about a tradition that's well over 5,000 years old. What was Kashmir's role in Indic civilization? We touch upon it in the video, that it was a center for Hindu and Buddhist learning. But what exactly does that mean? What were the contributions of Kashmiri Hindus from ages ago?
Thank you, Suhag. First of all, thank you for having me here. I really thank the Indo-American Foundation and the State Department for hosting me here. It's important to tell the story, and that's why I'm here. If you look at India as a civilization, India is considered the cradle of human civilization. And if you take Kashmir as the heart of that Indian civilization, going back 5,000 years, in my home, we have a calendar called Panchang. And Panchang is a calendar which is used right now. It's almost 5,100 years. So that gives the history and the role Kashmir has played for India and Indian civilization. If we go back to the land, how Kashmir was called Kashmir, the lake, it was underwater, and a rishi or a sage named Kashyap Rishi drained that water, and that's how the name Kashmir came into being. So the history in terms of connection to India. And how many of you do meditation? Can I see that? How many of you do meditation? The meditation, there is a text called Vijnana Bhairava Tantra. There are 112 dharas in that Tantra. Any type of meditation, anyone doing in this world is doing from that Vijnana Bhairava Tantra. And the Kashmiris have played a role in Vijnana Bhairava Tantra. The linguistics, when it comes to language, the grammar, the linguistics grammar, there was a sage named Panini who lived in Swat Valley. How do we know Swat Valley? Do people know Swat Valley? What do you know Swat Valley as?
Pakistan. Is it Pakistan today?
It's Pakistan. It's known for Taliban. And Panini was born in Swat Valley, and he's credited for creating linguistics grammar. And all the Indo-European languages are based on that grammar. That means the language itself has basis on that grammar. I can keep on counting the personalities who have contributed to the development of humanity and civilization. And these were the people who had total selfless service to the mankind and the humanity. So that's where I'm privileged, I'm honored to be from that heritage, which has that rich legacy.
So we'll circle back a little bit in terms of the protection and preservation of these traditions in the Kashmiri community. But before we go there, I'd like to first just talk about the exodus, the cleansing of Pandits from Kashmir. Walk us through those days. What was life like shortly before? We know that there's been multiple exoduses over the past 500 years, but the one that you witnessed, what was life like as a child? When did you realize something was awry, that something was changing?
So, as growing up as a child, I have heard stories from my grandmother. You know, when 1947 happened, when the tribals, and we saw that in the history, when the tribals attacked. And we are from a village, which is 25, 30 kilometers away from Srinagar. And so our grandma used to tell the stories that we had to leave that place and move to Srinagar. And when they came back, so to escape, to save their lives, their houses were burned. So that was the first kind of exodus or migration, you would say, from the villages to the city. And this was on and on. So when there was 1965 war, we again had to leave that place because we were a minority. And the first kind of attack was always the minorities in that space. So there were multiple exoduses, you may call it, from villages to city. And the final exodus, which was of course the 1989, was totally leaving the state and moving towards the plains of India. So let me back up into the political turmoil, what was happening. Between 1982, the Sheikh Mohammed Abdullah, who was the chief minister, passed away in 1982. So from 1982, his son became the chief minister. There was a political there was a political turmoil between 1982 and 1986. So in 1986, Farooq was removed from the chief ministership, and his brother-in-law came into power. And that turmoil was happening at the same time in 1987. The Afghan war was kind of winding down, 87, 88, 89. So all the resources, all the training camps which were in Pakistan, which were supporting the Afghan Mujahideens, the same infrastructure was used and turned around towards India and Indian part of Kashmir. Even for that matter, even Punjab also suffered from that, and it was in the problems from a terrorism standpoint. So those all the infrastructure moved towards the Kashmir. The same infrastructure, same training camps were used in Kashmir. So what we saw on the ground as a teenager, as a college-going person, was suddenly the extremist view of people started manifesting. You would see change in people's behavior. And at one point, it is January 1990. So the fear started building up as on the road, you would see people changing, their dress codes were changing, the extremist views were more on the road. 19 January 1990 was the turning point. What happened that night was suddenly within the mosques, there was a large, all the loudspeakers were on, and large mass of people with a lot of noise banging the rooftops of these mosques. And these rooftops are made of tin. In Kashmir, the roofs are made of tin, so they made a lot of noise. And the minorities who were living there were totally shocked and scared. And that was the turning point of the migration or exodus from Kashmir in that time. So what happened is, in fact, the first few casualties, the first casualty was Mr. Tikalal Taplu. He was a local leader, and he was killed. Further then, there were 3 or 4, and unfortunately, one of them, Satish Tikku, he was my father's cousin brother, and he was killed on the street. And what happened is, once he was killed, people who were trying to help during the last rites were asked that if you touch the body, you are going to be in the same boat. So such was the condition at that point. And the person who killed him, his name is Binta Karate, and he has accepted that he had role played in killing at least 25 to 30 Kashmiri Hindus or Pandits. And he's roaming scot-free. He's one of the politicians right now in Kashmir Valley. So that is the unfortunate part of our story, Suhag, that apathy, and since we are a minority, a Hindu minority, the voices have not been heard. And I hear a lot about human rights, and I don't see any human rights for us. I see a lot of noise about human rights, but I don't see no one talking about the Kashmiri Hindus and the traditions, the 5,000 years of tradition, and where we stand now. There are 1,000 Hindus which are remained in Kashmir, and we are very much worried about them, about their safety, because over the course of time, over the course of generations, that population has gone down.
So it sounds like it was systematic, because they went after leaders first. Because once you lose your leaders, the general public or the general community is obviously going to lose confidence, but also lose potentially direction. I want to go back a little bit on something you said that dress started changing, attitudes started changing. How would you describe Hindu-Muslim relations, like just at the everyday, everyman level? Prior to 89.
Absolutely. Just to give you a little background, 1948 happened, 65, 71. Of course, as a minority, there's always that, you don't have, there's always felt that, we're not being, supported. But if you look at the overall, from 5,000 years to 1989, as you can see, the percentage was going down. The percentage of Kashmiri Pandits or Hindus due to conversion, 500 years of Islamic rule, all that, the conversion, what was happening, was changing the demographics of the place. Still, the adaptation between the local communities was there. What was saving Kashmir was the Sufism, the Sufi Islam, which was kind of something which was holding the whole state together.
Like a mystical.
Like the mystical, you would have places where both Kashmiri Hindus and Muslims will go together. And again, this was something which emerged over the course of time and kind of helped continue the communities to work together. And that was the saving part, which was discussed, which was talked about by the leaders, that hey, we saw violence in other parts of India in 1947-48, but Kashmir was relatively safe because there was relative calm at that time. But drastic changes happened in 1989, and that was again a lot of influence from Afghanistan and Pakistan having that desire, that unfinished agenda, and unfortunately our Kashmiri Hindu minority became the victim of that. And that whole strategy of snatching Kashmir away from India.
So in my conversations, whenever I meet someone who had spent time in Kashmir, I oftentimes ask, where were you in '89? And some of the stories and the scenery and small details get etched into one's memory. And we have a good family friend who remembers that she and her sister were put under heavy blankets at the back of a Jeep in the hopes, their parents just kind of sent them off in the hopes that they would see them somewhere on the other side. And she could still visibly feel that shortness of breath and kind of looking back at the door of her home that they had had for generations, knowing that they'd never go back. So for you, because I know that you were there, what kinds of images are seared into your memories that you would rather forget, but are still there?
Absolutely. Wow, there are a lot of images. As I said, that one of my father's cousin brother was killed, and one of my uncles, who his name is Kanel Al-Bhatt, he was in the village. He used to work in a court office. And he used to help people. He had such a great relationship with people, whereas the peasants, whether irrespective of the religion, whether they were Muslims or Hindus, would come and seek help in the courthouse. And a bunch of people showed up at his door, knocked at the door, and asked him to come along with him. And the next day morning, we found his body in one of the fields, and body in shape which I can't describe. Another story, I had a friend, his name is Ashwani Garyali, and he used to teach kids. He was a teacher, and he used to teach students at Chatabal, which is another, in the downtown area of Srinagar. And some of the folks came, knocked at his door, dragged him out, and shot him dead. Another person, Ashok Bazaz, and he was a little shopkeeper, had 5 daughters. A single bread earner of the family. Again, same thing happened. Someone came during the night, knocked at the door, and shot him. So these are the stories which I want to forget. But this is such an important topic that I don't want this to repeat anywhere else. I don't want this kind of situation for any other minorities, any other communities who are living in this kind of a state. And it's important for me to be here, share the story, so it doesn't happen again.
Mm-hmm. So from just your own experience, people from all socioeconomic backgrounds. Obviously the one thing they shared was their Kashmiri Pandit heritage, but you have shopkeepers, you have people who are highly educated. So all these families are driven out. We know from the film that some end up in Jammu, others in camps in Delhi. Obviously in the diaspora, you're here today living in Chicago, but where did different types of people go? What was the kind of decision making that went into, or was there even a choice as to where you ended up, and where did you personally end up?
So once there is violence and once there is fear psychosis, once that comes in, people are looking for their lives. They're just doing whatever is possible, and whatever they can do, they're going after them. So what happened is each family was for themselves. There was a total chaos and void at the government level. When it came to local politicians, local leaders, in fact, few of the local leaders had left the country. And the minorities like us were left for no, means we had to live, we had to do something for ourselves. I'll tell you a story. When the day we left the state, banks were closed, because obviously banks are closed on a weekend. So Saturday banks are closed. We had to leave because we had a poster that you better leave by tomorrow, otherwise you're dead. So we did not have any money. So the all things we could take was the valuables, whatever the gold, whatever was available at home, because Indians generally have gold at home. We had money in the bank, but we could not take it out because the banks are closed. So had to travel without anything and restart building our lives in Jammu. Jammu was the transit camp, or camp where all the refugees from Kashmir were going. So all of us started moving out to Jammu. And that is the place where was the first kind of major camp for everyone. But when it came to support system, did people help? People were helping each other, but they were so worried about themselves that everyone was trying to leave the place. And especially when you heard, there was a killing in the neighborhood, and suddenly all 10 houses in the neighborhood would leave. Because there was so much fear created out. If there was a body found on the road, which was killed overnight, and suddenly next day, another 5 families would leave. So that was kind of the fear, and the only way was to escape and protect yourself. Mm-hmm. And the local administration, when it came to local government, they were not there.
So you go to Jammu, and then, we hear these stories, or rather we just kind of know numbers. This is how many refugee camps there are. These are the services. These are the dollars that are being spent. But we don't really fully understand, like you go from a home to perhaps a tent, or maybe to some temporary buildings. What did it take for your family to kind of get back on its feet? Clearly you've succeeded. You were able to pursue a college degree, but I know that not all families are as fortunate, but what sacrifice did it take on your parents' part, for instance, to make sure that you were able to continue life?
So when we moved to Jammu, imagine living in Canada and then suddenly moved to Arizona in the hot desert with 150 degrees or 115 degrees temperature. You're used to living in 70s, 60s, and suddenly you are transported and into an area with tents, no cover, and believe it or not, a lot of deaths happened because of snake bites.
Oh, okay.
A lot of deaths happened because of heat strokes, diabetes, and that was very common, very common. A lot of elderly people died in transit itself because they were not used to that heat. So a lot of sacrifices from the parents. In my case, my dad had passed away in '88. So for us, it was our mom and her kids. So it was literally starting life from zero, going back, settling in Jammu. Luckily, we found an accommodation first, because everyone was going to Jammu, the accommodation was limited. There were not many places there. So we had to find a place. And it took a while for us to find a place. Once we found a place, and then finding, as I said, the basic essentials for living, that was the struggle. And coming from that, it was, the only thing which was with us was that our parents had sent us to school. We had education, we had that background, and that was the saving grace, which kind of helped us to kind of succeed and continue to struggle though, but ultimately just keeping that value system which I bring from my heritage, I had options. I could have gone either ways in two different directions, but that is where the heritage and the value system played, which made me work more towards myself and looking more beyond the material stuff. So that was the strength within ourselves as a community, which is a vibrant community. I'm really proud of the community that we were able to sustain on our own without any support from any external teams or communities.
So HAF has done a great deal of work with Bhutanese refugee communities. 100,000 were cleansed from Bhutan in also around the same time period, maybe a little bit earlier, or later. And they too had struggles in refugee camps, and now they're being resettled here in the United States. And one of the greatest challenges they face is in the preservation and passing on of traditions, being outside of a homeland. So what has that been like for the Kashmiri community? You don't have access, one of the great joys I've had is to go back to my father's village and to see the goddess, the mini temple that's just in the middle of the village square. And you learn so much through the stories, but there's a lesson, a visceral telling of those stories and those lessons when you're able to be there. What efforts are being made in the community? What are the challenges to pass on the tradition and language? Language is so key to culture and tradition.
Yeah, it's a very, very tough journey we are going through as a community, as a family, because if you don't have that source, that well, where you can always go back and take that energy or take that source is gone, the roots are gone. If we had moved because of the opportunities or due to some other reasons, we still had a place to go back. And I could easily take my kids back saying, here is what your heritage is. Here is where you can, this is the well where you can take back your culture, your heritage, because roots are nourished, roots are there. But unfortunately, that is not. So when it comes to language, when it comes to culture, when it comes to heritage, that is missing. And we are trying our best as a community. We're trying our best to educate people around us and trying to kind of seek support in whatever place, whatever area we can, whether it is the other Hindu communities. In this case, this is a perfect example with Indo-American Foundation, or like organizations like that, where we can seek support and continue to protect our culture and our heritage. But language is something which is very difficult, which has been very challenging, because unless you speak that language, unless you have, and there has been a systematic change in the way the language in Jammu Kashmir was kind of taught. Unfortunately, the script we have is Sharda script, and Sharda script was over the course of time was replaced by Urdu written Kashmiri script. So it's like Kashmiri written in Urdu. It's like you write, Roman, in English.
Right.
So that's what happened over the course of time. So it's mostly spoken language, and that is all the more danger for losing that heritage. So language is a very tough one, which we as a community, we have an organization called Overseas Association of Kashmiris, KOA, it's called Kashmiri Overseas Association. And that is focused on the cultural aspect, the language and cultural aspect. We have get-togethers. Last year we had a camp in Chicago where we had some community members join together. So there are efforts to protect, but it's a big endeavor.
Mm-hmm. And in many ways, you're a minority within a minority. I know for the broader Hindu community, even protecting and preserving and passing on traditions is a challenge. Especially in the United States, where you see kind of a watering down of these traditions because we don't necessarily live in close proximity to one another. And so I can only imagine what challenges arise in this particular situation. So maybe we can start looking forward a little bit, as we've been looking back quite a bit. But do you have hopes of returning? What would be the first thing you'd do if you were able to go back home?
I am hopeful. I am hopeful of returning back. I'm hopeful that my kids can return back, visit the family. They can see the culture, they can celebrate the culture, they can celebrate the multicultural aspect of Kashmir. I'm hopeful that I can go back and meet my neighbors. And unfortunately, there are folks who are stuck as well in Kashmir, irrespective of Kashmiri Hindus. There are other minorities who are stuck. And I'm hoping that I can go back one day where I can meet those open-minded people, those people who are pre-1989, broad-minded, secular, open, that we can celebrate the culture together. And one of the thread which can connect is the Sufism. The Sufism or the mystic part of that is, in my opinion, that is the saving grace, where there can be a dialogue, there can be an inter-community conversation, because there are common threads in that space. So I'm hoping that there are folks in the valley who can step up beyond, because when it comes to extremist elements, there are extremist elements, but there are some sane voices there, and they step up and they start a conversation. So that's an important part.
So, if we were to be able to make this hope a reality, or to push that agenda forward, what would you say are the top 2 or 3 challenges that are rather immediate? It's been an ongoing situation, obviously, so there have been probably many challenges. But if we were to outline an action plan today, what would those 2 or 3 obstacles be that would need to be dealt with before any solution?
First and foremost is the trust when it comes to safety. So if the communities are turning back, how do we create that safety, that they feel comfortable, that they have a secure zone, a zone where they are comfortable, where they can practice their faith, where they can practice their culture, their heritage. I think that's very important. And how we create that zone where they can practice. That's the first. The second part is the financial. When it comes to jobs, when it comes to employment, encouraging the youngsters, create that city where the innovative youngsters can go and start building. At the same time, onus on the local community there, who are there right now, how do they start a dialogue or a conversation with the community, and so that those bridges can be made. But the first and foremost is that there has to be a zone created where safety is the most important thing, and in that zone where folks can start living and building their trust. Because right now the trust is not there.
Sure.
The trust is missing because we have suffered so much after 1989 and during 89 and onwards, that the trust is lacking. There was an initiative previously that, hey, we will return, Kashmiri Punts will go back, but then the separatist in Valley said, you can only go back to the places where you were living. Now, is that logical? Because those places have been burned. Those places are having either distress sales have happened from the community. How can they go back to the same places? And when there is no trust, is it possible? It's impossible. So that argument was kind of a way to kind of deflect, in my opinion, not being really truthful to themselves that, hey, really I want the community to be back.
Mm-hmm.
If you really want community to be back, give them space where they can come back. Then the onus is on the community, local community, to build trust.
Right.
And then build those bridges back and go back to that Sufism, go back to that mystic way of life where everyone is living together in that multicultural setting.
Right. A little bit more religious pluralism in the valley.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So, February 14th was actually not the last, probably the most major attack. There have been other skirmishes since. The government of India, and under the leadership of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, took some decisive action after that. That's not a government response we've seen in quite some time. So, what would you like this administration to do? In your estimation, is there buy-in from this administration to see some repatriation? I don't even know if that's the right word, because you're internally displaced. That's another thing that we haven't actually talked about, is that Kashmiri Pandits are not seen as refugees because they resettled back into the country within the same country. And so that has its own challenges. But what would you like this administration to do? Do you think that there's the will to act?
So based on the elections, recent elections, almost 1.3 billion people voted, and they have a clear majority in terms of, if you go back to 2003, or for that matter 2014, the question was, okay, we do have the seats in parliament, but the Rajya Sabha, so there were a lot of conversations around that. Our hope as Kashmiri Pandits, Kashmiri Hindu Pandits, is that there will be some movement in that space, that whatever has been pending for the last almost 30 years, next year is the 30th year of our exodus, that there is some concrete measures. As I said, the safety is important. To facilitate that return of Kashmiri Pandits, Kashmiri Hindus, there has to be a safe zone created. There has to be jobs available for folks to be attracted. And because a lot of the folks have moved on, because with apathy for such a long time, a lot of the youngsters have moved on and are doing something else. And for them to go back, there has to be an interest created so that they can go back and start, and they can contribute too. They can contribute to the local community, because local community needs help and support too. And traditionally, Kashmiri Hindus and Pandits have been teachers. They have helped the local community. They have inculcated that knowledge to the local masses as well, and they can be that instrument of help to the local community as well. And whatever they have in whatever spaces and positions they are, that's why the first part is create a safe zone. Second is let's give them the opportunities, employments. The third is and then bringing back the free flow of democracy into Kashmir. Should not be limited, and there should not be any exceptions. A person living in other part of India and in Kashmir should experience the same democracy.
Right.
And there were certain provisions in 1947, 1948. There were provisions to protect some of the areas, and that was right, because the protection was to make sure those villages, those mountains where people were living, that people will not grab their land, and there were certain reasons for that. But we have gone beyond that now.
Right.
So it's time to change those laws, change whatever change needs to be made, so there is free flow of people where people can celebrate democracy across any part of the state. I think it's high time that those changes are done, so that so there's no segregation.
Mm-hmm.
So people can practice their faith. People can practice the multicultural. They can experience the multicultural the world, which we all should be living in, which all of us are human beings.
Right.
So irrespective of the label and irrespective of what is being, so I think that's where I feel that there is some work to be done.
And in many ways, I mean, we saw the first picture of how beautiful Kashmir is.
Absolutely.
And so tourism obviously would benefit the region, but if it's not safe, you're kind of choking off any economic sustainability.
I think you bring a very good point. So there are pockets of traders, and there are folks who the tourism is the biggest industry. How do we bring them, rather than going through these private brokers? There are two parties. One is PDP and National Conference. And do we really need to go there? Why can't we have a direct contact with the people in villages?
Mm-hmm.
who can make a difference, who really want to have a better life for themselves. Why can't the government go straight to those? And there are people in villages who really need help. I think, and so that there's a lot of opportunity. How do we, and that the central government can facilitate and circumvent that they don't have to go through these power brokers and can directly go to the people, directly go to the villages, directly go to the people who matter and help them and show them a world which is different than what they are used to.
Right.
And there's an opportunity because they are in this, it's like being a frog in the well knows that is the world. Unless someone picks that frog and shows, hey, here is outside world, here is how life is lived. I think there is an opportunity.
Yeah. So I think we can maybe open up to audience questions. Do we have cards on the table, or should people just raise their hands and?
No, I think we can do an open Q&A here.
Okay, that sounds good.
So Nidhi, our intern, is going to be walking around with a microphone. If anybody has a question, please raise your hand and stand, identify yourself, and we'll go from there. I think at the front table.
I think I can speak loudly.
For recording purposes.
Oh, I see. So you talked about trust. So tell us a little bit more about the separatist mentality versus a common Kashmiri Muslims mentality. Is there a defining line there? In sort of what is the percent? Are we talking about separatists and those who are trying to impose Islamic or Muslim culture on Kashmiri? Is there a small minority of them imposing, and the common Kashmiri Muslim probably more aligned with sort of the multicultural? Or how is that mentality now spreading into a common Kashmiri?
That's a good question. As I said, that Kashmir had Sufi Islam. When it comes to Sufism, there was, and if you look at, it was very prevalent in Kashmir. Over the course of time, it's been 30 years now. And what happens is, as there is constant barrage, and again, orchestrated by Pakistan, that fundamentalist view, the Wahhabi view, which has been imposed, has influenced and has influenced the children who are now growing up, who are 30-year-old now, and they have lived that experience. And their forefathers, and I know their forefathers, when they speak to them, when they have that conversation, they're saying, this is not what we were 20 years back, 30, 40, 50 years back. So when it comes to separatists and separatist agenda, in this case, Hurriyat, for example, Hurriyat, again, those, I consider them as power brokers. Those are the folks who are 10% or 15% of the folks who control the power or who have that narrative, we hold that narrative. There is another percentage of people who are simple people. Kashmiris are simple at heart. And they are people in villages, people in remote areas who are living their life as daily wagers, as boatmen, as a shopkeeper. Those are the people we need to go and kind of rekindle that, hey, the spiritual Islam is more multicultural. It's more brotherhood, it's more oneness. It's not about extremism. So there's a lot of work to be done to change that mindset. But there are vested interests. That includes Pakistan, that includes the global jihad mentality, that includes the power brokers in Kashmir. So that has to be dealt with. And I believe the only government, or only power right now, the central government are in a position to deal with that, with a clear objective of saving that multicultural entity like Jammu and Kashmir.
Thanks for coming. Acknowledging the significance of the ethnic cleansing and the role of the growing terrorism in the region, there's been, I think, very valid criticism that the Indian government has taken a really heavy-handed approach to Kashmir in the repression of journalists, in terms of a over-targeting of civilians. So what do you think should maybe change in the way that the Indian government has approached policy in Kashmir, so that, you know, Kashmiri Pandits might be one day able to return, but also the response isn't so violent as it has been?
So I'll just go back to the heritage where I come from is about oneness. Right? So humanity being the first, and so when it comes to a violence, when it comes to a war zone, obviously there are two sides in a war zone situation, and there can, you know, when that warlike situation is happening, and obviously there can be things which happen. It can be if someone is pursuing a terrorist, pursuing, and now suddenly someone gets stoned. So there may be, you know, instances which happen in that case. I think the trust is the key thing. The trust between the local communities, having that safe zone where people can start interacting, and people who have been in that mode for the last 30 years, whether it is local population in Kashmir or Kashmiri Pandits who have left Kashmir. There has to be that dialogue, they have to be brought together, there has to be a zone created where that interaction happens. So that government has to play that role. The government has to build that safety net, that security around the Kashmiri Pandits who have lost trust, have to be brought back. Then the local community has to be encouraged, and I'm sure that is going to happen. The moment the communities are there, you know, it's like, okay, I'm in the neighborhood. Then do you think the people next door are not going to talk to me? They are going to talk to us. So I think that's it's the constant conversation between the communities, and the government has to play a key role in that, and facilitate those conversations. So if they build their safe zone to stage that, the next step is the communities get together and have more conversation.
I'm Raj Koul. I'm a researcher who investigates issues of internal displacement all over the world. About 8 years ago, I took on the issue of Kashmiri displacement with the George Mason University. And I look at the displacement of Kashmiri Pandits in the context of other communities that have been displaced. So after doing, Kashmir was my base case as a doctoral case. In the context of other communities that have been displaced, for example, in Georgia, Tbilisi, the Russian-occupied territory of Abkhazia in South Ossetia, the communities in Serbia, the Kosovo people who were displaced by Serbian ethnic forces. I have also been to Sudan, Khartoum, where the displaced Darfurs have been displaced and they remain displaced for 30 years. So my study is really about comparing and contrasting the issue of Kashmiri displacement with the similar communities that have been displaced and remain displaced, internally displaced for 30 years, so 27 years. So I agree with you totally that the integration and the return of the communities, such displaced by conflicts, my focus is really conflict-induced displacement as opposed to natural disasters, which are different. Return is much simpler in those cases because there is no stigma of being evicted from your neighbors, as it is for the Kashmiri and the Georgians and the Sudanese communities. So I do agree with you that the return is complicated. And return, once a community is displaced, like the Kashmiri community is displaced, the very fact that people are displaced is more than just a loss of home. It's the stigma of being evicted by your neighbors. So I have actually done my study as part of ethnographic study, where I resided with a family that was displaced and is living in the Jammu Jagti migrant camp. So I stayed with them for 1 week to do my study, ethnographic study, observing how they live. So yes, when I talk to the people who have been displaced, I've interviewed over 95 people in Kashmir and Jammu and Delhi, of course. One thing I have come to conclude is that in the context of all displacements, the displacement of Jammu, of the Kashmiri people, yes, it was a struggle, absolutely. Anytime community is displaced by conflict, it is a struggle. You lose bearings and you lose identity. But overall, in the context of other global communities, my focus has been to bring the issue of Kashmiri displacement in the global context. Just as you were mentioning that the attention was not given because it is a minority community, and so were the other communities that were displaced, so were the Georgians, so were the Azerbaijanis, Nagorno-Karabakh people. The difference with Kashmiri pundits is that some of the things that were done subsequent to displacement actually made them a little bit better off. I'm not saying, I don't mean to diminish the struggle of the Kashmiri pundits. What I'm saying in the context of other communities, other people remained uneducated. I have not found, in all my walking around Jammu, Japti migrant camps and Srinagar camps where people have returned, I did not find one single person who is begging on the metro, who is asking for money. Which I do find when I go to Azerbaijan, when I go to Sudan. Outside my classroom, there are people who are just living underneath the quarters there. Never a Kashmiri Pandit. So in a way, the education, the family that I stayed with in Jammu, the Panditji family, told me that yes, we are better off than we were because we would have never seen education in our life for the children. But yes, return is very complicated and it is a matter of what you are saying. You have to build the community and probably the tourism and the local youth has to participate in that. So I agree with you and I also, I'm thrilled that you are bringing up the issue which has remained under the table because the government says it is a sensitive issue. Even they would not give me interviews because I'm talking about some sensitive issue. So
Thank you for that comment. Do you want to touch upon, just in terms of the role of education as a value, as part of the heritage?
Yeah, I think that kind of hits the bullet point which I initially started with, that it is about the heritage. It is about the value system I belong to. And when I look at 5,000 years of history, I had a choice. If the community was in attack and violence, the choice was either you could go either direction. The violence can be responded with violence. But you will not find our community involved in any kind of violence. And the reason is that the heritage and the value system which we bring as the ancient civilization, and that is continuing, and that will continue because that is driven by that value system. And I think that's why the difference is. What do I value? If I value working on myself, or do I continue on doing something which is not me? So I think that's what as a world community, that's what as human beings, we have to pull these communities out. Whether it is Kashmir, whether it is Pakistan, whether it's Afghanistan, whether it is any of these extremist ideologies which separates a human being from another human being should be condoned. And what better country other than US, for that matter, to take on to that role of condoning the separatist idea about a human being. A human being should be free to practice any sort of religion, any sort of, it's a free will. There should not be any should not be persecuted. So the human, that's what the democracy is all about. And we as a community, that's why the reason I'm here is to share my thoughts and my ideas so that hopefully 2 or 3 of the folks here in this room can take it to the next level as well.
And I think right here in the front.
Hi. This issue of violence is, to me, quite interesting because obviously, what's going on in Kashmir involves a certain amount of aggression on the part of some forces and a lot of passivity on the part of a lot of people who, take the attitude that, we're a peaceful people, we just want to get along. And yet, we know from, the Bhagavad Gita, for example, that there are times when, war has to be waged in order to conquer the forces of adharma. Now, obviously, the government of India is doing, I think, what it can in order to use, violence in a way that can perhaps tamp down the aggressors, right? I think that's the impression I get, is that's what's happening over there. And yet, as this young lady said, there's a feeling that somehow the government of India is doing things that is creating excessive casualties among the civilian population, and that seems to be the narrative, that is spread. Yet, what is the way that the proper sort of approach to dealing with aggressors in such a situation, can be communicated so people will understand in the rest of the world?
So I'll give an answer. A surgeon is operating. If a surgeon is operating on a patient, and if there is disease, now if he cuts that body, it can be considered violence. But if a surgery is done to fix that human pain and that organ or that is in a different context. But if you take it from a violence standpoint, it is exactly the same, that hey, you're violent against that body. But the fact is, as human beings, when we look at the world beyond religion, beyond humanity, and if we're seeing that there are areas which needs help from an operations standpoint, and I see that as a human body, I'm comparing this as a human body, and I consider that as an operation of fixing that body. If it is in distress, if that role, I believe that those governments have to play that role because they have been elected by the people to play that role and also help the body. It's not that you have the surgery and then you just forget about it. So it's again goes back to the value system. It goes back to the human values. It goes back to what do we value as a democracy, and we are living in a democratic world, and obviously there will be dictatorships, and that's why they are dictatorships. So my response, my humble response is that the elected governments who have the mandate have to take steps to fix the problem, which is perceived, which is clear that if it is unjust, they have to take steps to fix those problems.
And sometimes it takes violence.
I'll just add that I think that we've heard how complex the situation is, and I think the solution is going to have to be multilateral. There's a place for government, there's a place for civil society, there's a place for economics, there's a place for conversation and peace building, and there's a place for defense, and hopefully not defense, but protection as well, not just always being in a reactive posture. So hopefully we'll see more of that sort of decisive action that we saw after February 14th, that when we're talking about the integrity of a nation, when there's an attack on Indian soil, that it needs to be dealt with appropriately. But within, I think the Bhagavad Gita does give us a framework for just war. That is our just war thesis. And there are limitations. You can read any sacred text, the Mahabharata or anything, where there are certain rules of engagement. And so I know that India is a secular democracy, but those teachings are part of the ethos, and I hope that those remain to be a guide, so that there isn't heavy-handedness where it's unnecessary. I think the Indian government could probably do a better job in telling its own story, in terms of what actions it's taking and why it's taking it. So hopefully we'll see more of that. We have a very social media savvy government now, or at least a prime minister, so India does. So we'll see what the future holds in terms of that storytelling on India's part.
So we have been
One
given
last
indication
question.
that this is our last two questions. If we can make them short and together, and then our panelists will answer, and then we'll disperse.
Okay. My question is basically regarding extension of the topic we were just discussing. Given the fact that in America, in Europe, the Pakistani American community and the larger pan-Islamist community is very active, both in their institutions, mosques, and areas, as well as at the secular spaces like campuses and the Capitol Hill. Very, very active in promoting their narrative on Kashmir, which is obviously a separatist narrative and a pan-Islamist narrative. What are you doing as Kashmiri Hindu community in America specifically to counter this narrative, and how can the rest of the Hindu community and the larger American community join in this effort?
And then this question, and then we'll take it together.
Yeah, it's a great question, and this is the event. Means this is the event. What we are doing right now is the proof of that. So more and more of these events, more and more of this information, which tells the truth. And I've seen information campaigns. In fact, there was this gentleman named Fai, and he was found an ISI agent. And he was doing campaigns. He would meet, he would do all the rounds around Washington, D.C., and then finally he was caught. So if there is truth, it will shine. If it is a lie, it is going to be caught at one point. So that's what we need to do as a community, that we have to tell the truth, we have to tell the story, we have to tell the reality of the situation. And I'm sure the folks who are even in that camp, who have that Sufi Islam lineage, who understand the reality of oneness of God, will step up, will come up and join the forces. So I think we need to continue to tell the truth and bring that reality to every space of people's lives.
After all, Satyam Eva Jayate.
I'll just quickly add to that before we take this last question, that I think that there has been a change, at least in our interactions on Capitol Hill, in the last, probably since Osama bin Laden was found or killed in Pakistan, where before bringing these topics up were kind of off limits, or we would just kind of get a hushed silence as we brought up the issue of Kashmiri Pandits. But I think that there's more awareness, and as the US-India partnership continues to grow stronger between the largest and oldest democracy, and the relationship with Pakistan is shifting. I think that there's a great opportunity for organizations from within the Kashmiri Pandit community, as well as organizations like Indo-American Foundation and others, to exercise our voice as members of a democracy and make sure that we're doing our part.
Last question.
I have plenty of questions, but I do not want to ask them all. I just have to probably stick with one, since I've been given by Jay only one. So the question that I have is that why is it that it is so complex to, first of all, they are Kashmiri Hindus, they're not Kashmiri Pandits alone, they're Kashmiri Hindus. Why is it so complex to resolve the issue of why is it that the alley takes up so much of our noise and discussion space? whereas it's Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh, obviously. So, and there is a greater interest of the Hindus in Ladakh and Jammu, and why aren't their interests being taken into consideration? Why do we still have Sikhs and Hindus who came from Pakistan living in Jammu who don't have citizenship? They cannot vote. So until we resolve our own internal fault lines, violence or non-violence is not going to get us at the problem. We have an institutional problem. Article 35A stares us in the face. What are we doing about it?
So absolutely. So Article 35A and 370, there's a lot of buzz these days about that, and I'm hoping that, and again, I'll leave that to the government of India to kind of address that. And that is in their space, and with the current, the recent Modi government coming into power and the type of majority they have, we're just looking for them to solve for this. Again, this is a pending issue for a while. What my specific focus is, how do we protect our community? How do we protect our heritage? And how do we inform people about the reality of the situation and what happened to us? But I'm hopeful, absolutely, because that is an important aspect of fixing the problem, that there will be some movement in the near future in that space. Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for coming all the way. Thanks to all of you for your time.
And everybody, please stay tuned for the history of the Kashmir conflict, part 3. Parts 1 and 2 are available on HAF's YouTube page. This is HAF's official sidebar event to the State Department International Religious Freedom Ministerial, and it has been a pleasure to be with all of you this evening. Please get home safely. It does look ominous outside, and we hope to see you again soon at another HAF event. Good evening.
Thank you.